Hey, what's up guys? Welcome back to another video, and today we'll be taking a look at some more fighting games that are released on the Game Boy line of systems. I've already covered the Mortal Kombat ports on Game Boy. We all know that all of them except for 2 are really bad and not worth your time. Mortal Kombat wasn't the only fighter released on the Game Boy. There was tons of fighters of different qualities released on the Game Boy line of systems. I won't be covering every single one in this video, but I'll cover the notable ones that were released on the Game Boy. Now let's get into it. The first game we'll be looking at today is Battle Arena Toshinden. It was first released as a launch title for the PlayStation in 1995. The game was later ported to the Game Boy by Takara in 1996, and the game actually isn't that bad. This game is really fun to play on the Game Boy. The game is mostly based off of the original PlayStation version, but it includes a slightly altered story mode, and an early appearance of the character Uranus in the Battle Arena Toshinden version of Gaia without his armor. This game is really easy for the most part. I beat everybody on my first try until I got to Gaia and Uranus. Both bosses are really cheap, and it took me a good 10 minutes to beat them both. This game is pretty good for the Game Boy, and Takara did a good job converting the original PlayStation game to work on the Game Boy. One more thing I have to say before I move on to the next game. This game has Super Game Boy enhancements, and you could play 2 players without needing 2 Game Boys. The King of Fighters 95 also saw a release on the Game Boy, and it was released in 1997 in North America, and it's a decent fighter for the console. The graphics and sound are okay, and the controls take some time to get used to, but once you do, the game is really fun. Every character that you would expect from the KOF series is here, along with some secret characters from the Samurai Shodown series. KOF 95 is a very good fighter for the Game Boy. Takara once again did a good job converting this game from the arcade to work on the Game Boy. Samurai Shodown was also ported to the Game Boy. It was developed again by Takara, and it was released around the same time as the SNES and Genesis ports in 1994, and the Game Boy port of this game is very impressive. The graphics are obviously not as good as the console ports, but Takara somehow crammed just about every bit of playability from the arcade version onto a tiny Game Boy cartridge. Every character is here with all their special moves intact, and they even made the story better with new character-specific cutscenes showing between every fight. Samurai Shodown is a very decent port for the console, and it shows that Takara knew what they were doing when porting these games over to the Game Boy. Here's one last game that was released by Takara, and it's World Heroes 2 Jet. It was released in 1995, and it's another great port for the Game Boy. The game plays really well, the controls are responsive, there's new moves for the characters, there's Super Game Boy support, which makes the game a whole lot better. This is also the first and only game in the series to get a port on a handheld console. World Heroes 2 Jet is a very decent port to the Game Boy, and Takara yet again managed to get this game to work on the Game Boy. Killer Instinct was also released on the Game Boy around the same time as the Super Nintendo port in 1995. It was developed and published by Rare and Nintendo, and this is another very impressive port for the Game Boy. The graphics look really good for the Game Boy, and then there's an awesome 8-bit rendition of the soundtrack. The controls are also responsive, and the special moves were easy to pull off. Every character except for Cinder and Riptor are here, and their stages are still intact. The only major downside with this port is the moves for the characters are severely altered due to the limitations of the Game Boy hardware. Besides from the complaint, Killer Instinct on the Game Boy is still a decent port, and it's a good way to play Killer Instinct on the go. The game has support for the Super Game Boy, which adds a unique background, more colors to the screen, and 2-player versus with a second controller. Next up, here's Primal Rage on the Game Boy. It was developed by the same company who made the first 2 Mortal Kombat ports, Probe Software, and it was released in 1995, and it's okay. The graphics were massively downgraded from the arcade and console ports, Every character has a reduced moveset, but most of the fatalities are still here. This port excluded Vertigo from the roster. The controls feel very responsive, and the game has a solid frame rate throughout the game. Overall, Primal Rage on Game Boy is a good port, but it's not as good as the other ports I've already mentioned. It's tough to recommend this over the console versions or the other great fighters on Game Boy. Street Fighter II on Game Boy was developed and published by Capcom, and it was released in 1995, which was way too late because there was already 5 revisions in the arcade, 3 different versions on Super Nintendo, and most importantly, Mortal Kombat and a bunch of other fighters already had entries on the Game Boy. So Street Fighter was very late to the party. But was it worth the wait? No, because this version is terrible. Where do I start? The gameplay is really slow, the controls aren't that great, the graphics don't look that great even for Game Boy standards. A ton of characters are missing, including Dhalsim, E. Honda, Vega, and all of the new characters that were introduced in Super Street Fighter II. There's only 2 buttons on the Game Boy, so the special moves are a little harder to pull off, and the strength of the punches and kicks is determined by the duration of the button presses. The only real positive thing I can say about this port is the music sounds great in this version. The game seems like a port of the World Warrior since it uses the same box art design from the original SNES port, but it's not. It combines elements of both the Champion Edition and Super, and with a few elements from Super Turbo mixed in. The graphics, character portraits, and stages are based on Super Street Fighter II, although some moves such as Blanca's Amazon River Run from Street Fighter II Turbo are included. I love how they use the character portraits from Super Street Fighter II even though none of the new characters are included. If you beat the game on normal difficulty, you just get the Capcom logo and no endings, but if you beat the game on the hardest difficulty, you get the endings for all the characters. Every stage has its own background if you play it on the Super Game Boy, and just like the other games I mentioned, it supports 2 players with a second controller. Overall, the Game Boy port of Street Fighter II is a terrible port, and at least it's better than the terrible Mortal Kombat ports. This game must have sold well. It got a Player's Choice re-release in 1998. I would only recommend this if you have to own every version of Street Fighter II. Next up is Street Fighter Alpha Warrior's Dreams on the Game Boy Color. It was developed by Crawfish Interactive and released in 2000. I gotta say, this is a huge improvement compared to the Street Fighter II port on Game Boy. Since the character roster on Street Fighter Alpha is small, the entire roster is here. Akuma, Dan, and M. Bison are hidden away. Every stage is here, and they look great. The game controls well, and the graphics and music aren't too bad either. My only real complaint is the screen turns black after you complete a round, and the only thing that's shown on screen is the character and the stats. Besides the complaint, Street Fighter Alpha on Game Boy Color is a flawless port and it's probably the best fighter on Game Boy Color. Next up is Super Street Fighter II Turbo Revival on the Game Boy Advance. It was developed and published by Capcom and released in 2001. This game is actually a rearranged version of Super Turbo with a new title screen and new character illustrations. Since the Game Boy Advance has 4 buttons instead of 2, the 4 buttons can easily be customized in the settings. The basic character sprites and animations were transferred from the Super Nintendo version of the original Super Street Fighter II. The new techniques that were added from Super Turbo used the same sprites and animations as the arcade version. This results in a few characters suddenly growing in size for a moment after performing certain moves, such as Guile's standing heavy kick, since the arcade version used bigger sprites than the Super Nintendo version. Likewise, the animation frames when a character advances towards an opponent are the same as when he or she retreats. Only Akuma uses character sprites exclusively from the arcade version, as his advancing and retreat animations are different as a result. Several stages have been changed and instead uses stages from other games in the franchise or completely new stages. Ken, Giles, and M. Bison stages are completely new. Zangief's and Balrog's have been modified. Ryu's is taken from Street Fighter III Third Strike, and Chun-Li's stage is taken from Street Fighter Alpha 2. Akuma now has his own stage, which is an altered version of Ryu's. All the voice clips of the characters are taken from the arcade version, with the exception of Ryu's, which is based on the original Street Fighter II, while Akuma's voice clips are from the Street Fighter Alpha games. While the music quality is not of the same rate as the arcade version, the Danger versions of the stage themes are included just like the arcade version, and their exclusive remixes as well. Akuma and Shin Akuma can be unlocked. There's a game-breaking bug in the North American version of this game where the game will glitch out when you try to fight Shin Akuma. The game just shows a glitched picture of Shin Akuma, and his theme would play endlessly until you turn off the game. This glitch is only present in the North American version. It's not present in the Japanese version. Besides the game-breaking bug, Super Street Fighter II Turbo Revival is a flawless conversion for the GBA, and I would highly recommend giving it a try. Next up is Tekken Advance. It was developed and published by Namco and released in 2001. The gameplay is very similar to the other Tekken games in the franchise, but since the game is on a handheld system, the inputs were simplified or removed altogether. It uses a single input system with kick mapped to the A button, punch to the B button, and the left and right triggers used for tagging and throwing, respectively. The game also includes a step-step feature. The game adds new mechanics by implementing a wide range of stun variations such as pop stuns, crumple stuns, and right and left stuns despite the simplification. The game is non-canonical to the Tekken storyline, but follows the events of Tekken 3. It uses the sprites based on Tekken 3's 3D models for its characters. Most of the starter characters from Tekken 3 are included, with exceptions of Eddie, Gordo, and Li Wulong. Gunjack, who was unlockable in Tekken 3, is playable from the start, with Heihachi being the sole unlockable character, and the final boss in Lee of Ogre. Overall, Tekken Advance is a pretty good fighter for the GBA, and it was the first Tekken game to be released on a Nintendo console. Next up is the King of Fighters EX. It was released in 2002. King of Fighters EX is an adaptation of the King of Fighters 99 for the Game Boy Advance, with a new character named Mo Habana. Geese Howard is the final boss, with Lori being a sub-boss. The game is a huge step up from the original Game Boy games. It actually feels like the arcade version since it's on the Game Boy Advance, and it's really fun to play. 1 year later, EX2 was released. It was an adaptation of the King of Fighters 2000 for the Game Boy Advance, with Mo Habana returning along with new characters Reggie Okami, Jun Kajami, Miyu Kurosaki, and Shinobu as the final boss, and a new stage. EX2 is a huge improvement compared to EX1. If you want a KOF game on the Game Boy Advance, then EX2 is the way to go. Next up is Guilty Gear X Advance Edition. It was developed by Arc System Works and published by Sammy Studios and released in 2002. The game features simplified gameplay due to the GBA's hardware limitations. This version adds tag and 3-on-3 modes along with arcade, survival, and training modes from the original game. In tag mode, the player selects 2 characters which can be switched in-game. The character not in play slowly regains health. In 3-on-3 mode, the player selects 3 characters who fight in order that they are selected. Characters cannot be swapped unless the previous character is defeated, similar to the King of Fighters series. Extra versions of the characters can be unlocked, similar to EX versions in the later games. It includes all playable characters from the arcade version except for Robokai, whose moveset is implemented into Kei Kasaki's extra version. Character color palettes can be edited but they do not inherit Black Select and Gold Select powers as they do in X+. Upon completing the arcade mode, an ending is displayed, unlike the North American and European releases of the Dreamcast and PS2 releases. All in all, Guilty Gear X Advance Edition is a fun fighter for the GBA, and I would recommend giving it a try. Lastly, here's Street Fighter Alpha 3 for the Game Boy Advance. It was developed by Crawfish Interactive and released in 2002. The game is technically a port of Street Fighter Alpha 3 Upper. The announcer is missing and some stages got cut out, but the game makes up for it by including the entire roster from the arcade version, plus 3 additional characters. Only a small number of character voices are included in this version due to storage limitations, which the developers worked around by having characters share voice samples, modified with real-time pitch shifting, such as using a higher-pitched version of Ken's voice for Sakura's attack calls. Similar to the last Street Fighter on GBA, there's a modified control scheme which works really well. Most of the modes are here except for the World Tour mode from the PS1 and Dreamcast ports. The graphics and quality are really close to the console versions, the game controls well, and it's really easy to pull off the special moves. After the impressive port of Street Fighter Alpha to the Game Boy Color, Crawfish somehow managed to push things to the limits to port Street Fighter Alpha 3 to the Game Boy Advance. It's just a shame that Alpha 3 caused the end of the company. Only one can imagine what Crawfish could have accomplished on the DS if they had the chance to. Street Fighter 3 on the GBA is a very flawless port, and it was the best way to play Alpha 3 on the go for years until Alpha 3 Max was released on the PSP. I would still recommend giving the GBA version a try if you're curious. Well folks, that is the end of the video. I hope you enjoyed watching it, and I will catch you in the next one. Until next time, thank you for watching.